When you hear the term serial killer, certain names instantly come to mind. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer. These figures are etched into the fabric of true crime history. Their lives and atrocities endlessly dissected in documentaries, dramatizations, and podcasts. They have become synonymous with evil icons of brutality whose stories are known worldwide. But for every notorious murderer whose crimes became media spectacles, there are countless others who committed acts just as horrific, yet remain virtually unknown. These lesser-known predators devastated families and left behind trails of blood and heartbreak, rivaling the horror inflicted by any infamous name you've ever heard. Today, we delve into the shadows, into the forgotten chapters of true crime history, to shed light on 5 of the most sadistic and calculating serial killers you've likely never encountered before. These are not insignificant footnotes in criminal history. They were monsters who operated in plain sight, ghosts in the system who managed to avoid capture for years, while carrying out unthinkable violence. Their crimes left a legacy of unanswered questions and unspeakable trauma. Among them, the Oakland County child killer, a phantom predator who haunted the affluent neighborhoods of suburban Detroit and may still be out there. Walter E. Ellis, a man who lived a double life in Milwaukee, murdering for over 2 decades without raising suspicion. Clifford Olson, Canada's most reviled child murderer who turned death into a currency. And William Suff, the Riverside prostitute killer who walked seamlessly between his job and his atrocities in a deeply disturbing way. What makes these cases particularly horrifying isn't just the staggering body counts or the shocking violence. It's the invisibility of the killers, the way they concealed themselves behind masks of normalcy while carrying out evil so profound it defied comprehension. Some of them are still alive, sitting in prison cells, their secrets locked behind prison walls. Others died without facing justice, their victim counts lost to time. But every one of them left behind an enduring stain on the communities they preyed upon. Before we dive into these stories, let me issue a warning. The content we about to explore isn't just dark. It's profoundly disturbing. We're not merely dealing with violent crime. We're dealing with calculated cruelty, acts so meticulous and malevolent they challenge our very understanding of human nature. If you're not ready to face the darkest corners of humanity, now would be the time to stop reading. But if you're still here, it means you understand why these stories matter. We don't tell them for shock or entertainment. We tell them because to forget these victims is to allow their killers to win twice. We begin with a case that proves sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who are never brought to justice. It all started in the winter of 1976 in Oakland County, Michigan, a region known for its affluence and safe suburban lifestyle was about to be shattered by a string of murders unlike anything law enforcement had seen before. This wasn't the work of a deranged vagrant or a visibly disturbed outcast. This was someone who understood children's, someone who could gain their trust with ease and vanish without a trace, someone who orchestrated every move with chilling precision. The nightmare began on February 15th, 1976. 12-year-old Mark Stebbins was walking home from a local pool hall in Ferndale, just a few blocks from his home. He was known to be a responsible boy, the kind who always informed his parents if he was going to be late. When he failed to show up for dinner that evening, his family sensed immediately that something was terribly wrong. 4 days later, Mark's body was discovered in a snowbank in Southfield. He had been strangled, but what truly stunned investigators was the condition of the body. He was fully clothed, his clothing had been washed, and his hair had been combed. His appearance was disturbingly clean. Even more unsettling was the fact that he had been fed Kentucky Fried Chicken, his favorite meal, shortly before his death. This was not a hasty crime, had been carefully planned and carried out with disturbing attention to detail. Later that same year, on December 22nd, 1976, 10-year-old Jill Robinson vanished after a disagreement with her mother. She stormed out of their house on her bicycle, intending to ride to her father's home a few miles away. She never arrived. 12 days passed before her lifeless body was discovered near Interstate 75. Once again, the same haunting signs appeared. She was fully clothed, and her bike was found neatly propped up nearby. Everything about the scene suggested control, calculation, and a killer who knew exactly what they were doing. Barely a week into the new year, on January 2nd, 1977, another 10-year-old, Christine Mihelek, disappeared while walking to a 7-Eleven store near her home in Berkeley. For 19 agonizing days, her family hoped and searched. Then, her body was found in a snowbank in Franklin Village. The now familiar pattern repeated itself. The clean clothing, the carefully placed body, and the unmistakable sense that whoever was responsible was following a ritual, one that they repeated with precision and purpose. The entire community of Oakland County was soon gripped by fear. Parents kept their children indoors. Schools rolled out emergency safety measures. The media dubbed the suspect the Oakland County child killer, and a wave of dread blanketed the region. Despite the public hysteria, the killer remained at large, undeterred and meticulous. Then, on March 16th, 1977, 11-year-old Timothy King asked his mother for permission to walk to a nearby pharmacy to buy some candy. The store was less than 6 blocks away in Birmingham, and he promised to return in half an hour. But Timothy never came home. 6 days later, his body was found in a shallow ditch in Livonia, just 20 miles from where he vanished. As with the others, he was fully clothed, clean, and carefully positioned. But this time, investigators noticed something different. Despite being missing for almost a week, Timothy's body showed no signs of decomposition. He had been kept alive for several days, fed and tended to before finally being killed. The contents of his stomach, Kentucky Fried Chicken, the exact same meal Mark Stebbins had been given before his murder. The investigation ballooned into one of the most extensive in Michigan's history. Authorities launched a massive task force, interviewing hundreds of potential suspects, chasing down over 18,000 leads and pouring millions of dollars into the case. Composite sketches were released. Witness statements were analyzed. The police knew they were dealing with someone who had intimate knowledge of the area, someone who blended in seamlessly and could have easily been a neighbor, teacher, or even a trusted community figure. Yet, despite the intense manhunt, the killer was always a step ahead. After Timothy King's death, the murders ceased just as suddenly as they had started. No more children disappeared. No more bodies were found. The phantom vanished into thin air, leaving behind a wake of grief and fear that lingered for decades. Over the years, numerous suspects emerged. One was Christopher Bush, a known pedophile who died by suicide in 1978. Another was Arch Sloan, a convicted sex offender who claimed to have knowledge of the murders. Investigators even uncovered ties to Francis Sheldon, a wealthy man with connections to a child pornography ring operated from a private island. Despite these promising leads, none of them could be definitively linked to all four murders. The case has never been officially closed. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have allowed detectives to retest old evidence. Witnesses have been re-interviewed. New forensic techniques have been applied to aging crime scene materials. Yet, to this day, the identity of the Oakland County child killer remains unknown. A ghost in the system, a nameless predator who slaughtered 4 children and slipped away into obscurity. What makes this case so profoundly chilling? Ice and tea, just the youth of the victims, or the fact that their killer was never caught? It's the deliberate, calculated methodology behind each act. The grooming, the extended captivity, the post-mortem carol of it points to a killer who treated murder not as impulse, but as craft. This was someone who planned every aspect of the crime, who viewed his victims not as people, but as objects in a grim performance. To this day, the families of Mark Stebbins, Grizz Robinson, Christine Mihalik, and Timothy King continue to seek justice. If they were alive today, they'd be adults, perhaps parents, living full lives. Instead, their stories remain frozen in time, tragic reminders of innocence stolen and justice denied. The Oakland County child killer may no longer be alive. He may have taken his secrets to the grave, or he may still be living quietly, an elderly man hiding in plain sight in some suburban town, his past buried beneath layers of anonymity and time. We may never know the truth, but what we do know is that this was one of the rare cases where the killer got away not once, but 4 times. And that is what cements the Oakland County child killer as one of the most terrifying and enigmatic predators in American history. Not just because of what he did, but because he was never caught, because justice was never served, because four families never got the closure they deserved. Now we turn to Walter E. Ellis. The scene of Deborah Harris's murder was nothing short of eerie. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The rooms remained disturbingly tidy, undisturbed, except for the terrible presence of the lifeless body that lay within. Everything looked untouched, eerily frozen in time, as if life had simply stopped in place. To the detectives on the scene, it was as if the killer had entered and exited like a ghost, leaving behind no chaos, no mess, and no obvious reason for the crime. Homicide detectives found themselves stymied almost immediately. Deborah had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in any high-risk relationships, had no jealous ex-boyfriends, and no one in her life seemed to have a clear motive for ending it. She was, by all accounts, a hard-working and quiet woman who kept mostly to herself. Officers canvassed the area, questioned her friends, interviewed co-workers, and retraced her final steps. They followed up every lead they could find, but none of them pointed to a viable suspect. Walter Ellis's name was not mentioned, not once. He was neither suspected nor questioned. He existed only as a silent presence, hidden within the crowd, a man so ordinary and forgettable that his existence barely registered in the minds of those around him. He was simply another face in a sea of faces, another name in passing conversation, easily lost and effortlessly dismissed. What law enforcement failed to realize at the time was that they were dealing with a predator of exceptional cunning. Walter Ellis didn't resemble the archetype of a serial killer. He wasn't the stereotypical recluse hiding in the shadows. In fact, he could be quite sociable when the situation called for it. He had charm when he needed it. He could be helpful and generous, seemingly trustworthy. More than anything, Walter had an uncanny talent for reading people as expectations, and then becoming exactly what they wanted to see. It was a performance he had honed for years, becoming invisible through conformity. He cycled through a variety of blue-collar jobs: bartender, construction worker, janitor, maintenance staff positions that allowed him access to apartment buildings. alleyways, basements, and all the quiet places a killer could hide. These jobs brought him into contact with vulnerable people, many of them women struggling with poverty or addiction. Through these roles, he learned to observe quietly, to blend in, and most importantly, to pick out potential victims without raising a hint of suspicion. After the murder of Deborah Harris, Walter went silent for a time. It wasn't that his desire to kill had vanished. Far from it. What had changed was his method. He had taken his first steps into darkness, and now he was learning from them. He wasn't hasty, he was deliberate. He began to educate himself. He read about police procedures, followed news stories about crime investigations, and refined his approach. And most critically, he shifted his focus to women who, tragically, might not be missed right away. He began to target sex workers, women who battled addiction, and those who lived at the fringes of society, women whose disappearances might take days or even weeks to draw attention. It was a horrifyingly strategic choice, designed to delay discovery and reduce the pressure on law enforcement to investigate quickly. In 1986, Walter struck again. This time, the victim was Sheila Ferrier, a 19-year-old mother of two. Sheila, in her efforts to provide for her children, sometimes worked as a prostitute on Milwaukee's North Side. Her body was discovered in a dilapidated, abandoned building, lying lifeless and cold. She had been strangled. The parallels to the Deborah Harris case were unmistakable. The method of killing, the calm and calculated staging of the body. But this time, Walter had become even more careful. He had taken deliberate steps to eliminate physical evidence. He cleaned the area, wiped down surfaces, and selected a location where the body might lie undiscovered for an extended period of time. And for a while, that strategy worked. A pattern had emerged, one that would continue to repeat itself for the next 15 years. Walter Ellis continued his killing spree with unnerving consistency, murdering at least 5 more women using the same quiet, brutal method. He would approach them casually, often as if he were a friend or someone looking for company or offering help. He understood who to target: women who looked tired, stressed, desperate. He didn't chase. He didn't abduct with force. Instead, he drew them in, gained their trust, and then extinguished their lives in the most intimate, horrifying way, with his bare hands. What made Walter Ellis particularly dangerous wasn't just his intelligence or methodical process, was his patience. He didn't kill frequently. He could go months, even years, between murders, living an utterly ordinary life. In the meantime, he held jobs. He cared for his aging mother. He maintained relationships. He paid his bills and kept appointments. He existed among people, passing them in grocery store aisles and on sidewalks, without ever giving them a reason to fear him. To the people in his orbit, Walter was quiet but dependable. The kind of man who might help a neighbor shovel their driveway after a snowfall, or lend someone a few dollars to cover their gas bill. He was background noise, remarkable, unmemorable, and because of that, deeply effective at hiding his true nature. Then, in 2009, everything changed. It wasn't a confession or a witness that brought Walter down. It wasn't a sudden slip-up or a moment of guilt. After nearly 30 years, advancements in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, finally gave law enforcement the tool they needed to piece the puzzle together. Investigators re-examined old evidence from cold cases and submitted samples to newly updated databases. When the results came back, the picture was chilling. 7 murders, 1 man. The DNA matches left no room for doubt. Every crime scene pointed to the same individual. Milwaukee had, indeed, been home to a serial killer for more than 2 decades, who had operated in the shadows with absolute impunity. But the revelations didn't stop there. What shocked investigators even more was the discovery that Walter Ellis had been in the system the entire time. Over the years, he had been arrested multiple times for domestic disputes, public intoxication, disorderly conduct. Nothing serious enough to raise red flags. But each time, he had managed to avoid lengthy prison sentences. Each time, the system had released him unaware of the blood on his hands. When police finally arrested Walter Ellis in 2009, the community reacted with disbelief. Those who knew him, neighbors, co-workers, even family, were stunned. They couldn't reconcile the friendly man who mowed his lawn every weekend with the monster the police now described. This was not the picture of a serial killer. He didn't look the part. He didn't act the part. And yet, the evidence was irrefutable. During his interrogation, Walter tried initially to deny everything. He maintained the illusion, the mask he had worn for decades. But when confronted with the DNA evidence that tied him directly to multiple crime scenes, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. And yet, even in confession, Walter's demeanor remained disturbingly cold. He didn't rant or rave. He didn't cry or express remorse. He spoke with a strange detachment, as if he were recounting someone else's story. He referred to his victims not as women, not as people, but as objects, utilities, temporary needs, tools for his gratification. To hear him speak was more unsettling than any outburst of emotion. There was no rage, no regret, only indifference. In his mind, the murders were a means to an end. The fact that they involved real people with names and families seemed irrelevant to him. Investigators eventually mapped out a chillingly consistent pattern in Walter's crimes, but it wasn't a pattern in the traditional sense. Unlike many serial killers who escalate over time, becoming more violent or more frequent, Walter maintained a disturbingly steady rhythm. He didn't allow himself to get sloppy. He killed only when the conditions were right, when the risks were low. He never let the desire override his self-discipline. That control, more than anything, is what allowed him to remain free for so long. Perhaps the most haunting realization of all was that Walter Ellis had never been far away. He lived near some of his victims. He shopped at the same convenience stores. He attended the same public gatherings. He wasn't hiding in some remote cabin. He was right there living a normal life, smiling at strangers and going unnoticed. He was the embodiment of evil in camouflage. For the families of his victims, the aftermath was agonizing. There was no warning, no explanation. Their loved ones hadn't been lured away by some deranged-looking lunatic. They had been approached by someone who looked like everyone else, someone no one had a reason to fear. In 2011, Walter Ellis was convicted and sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole. But that would not be the final chapter. In December 2013, just 4 years into his sentence, Walter Ellis died in prison. No cause of death was immediately released. And with his death, he took with him every secret, every untold truth, every potential name that might still remain unknown. Investigators believe that there may be more victims, women whose bodies were never discovered, or whose murders were never properly connected to the pattern. Walter Ellis' story is a stark and disturbing reminder that evil doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it shows up on time for work, tips the waitress, and helps push a neighbor's car out of the snow. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who understand that the best place to hide is in plain sight. His case forces us to reconsider our notions of what a monster looks like. We want villains to be grotesque, visibly disturbed, wearing their darkness like a mask. But reality is rarely so convenient. Walter Ellis proved that some of the most terrifying predators walk among us every day, hiding behind their ordinariness. For 21 years, he lived like this, seemingly harmless, shockingly invisible. And in that time, he claimed the lives of at least 7 women. He breathed their last breaths. He left behind grieving mothers, orphaned children, and questions that may never be answered. But he was not the only ghost to walk unnoticed through American streets, because the next man we must confront left a trail of blood far wider. He was a drifter, a traveler, a man with a charm that disarmed and a method that appalled. His name was Jake Bird, and for over 40 years, he turned the American railroad system into a highway of horror. What made Jake Bird different wasn't just his brutality, but the fact that his final words would send chills down the spines of seasoned detectives and hint at horrors still yet to be uncovered. From Texas to Oregon, rural families were being slaughtered in the stillness of their own homes, all by the same unseen hand-wielding, terrifying precision. Jake Bird had refined his method over decades, targeting households that were geographically isolated. Out in the countryside, where screams would go unheard, and bodies might lie undiscovered for days. His instincts for identifying vulnerability were unnervingly accurate. He zeroed in on victims who were alone, defenseless, and cut off from immediate help. In 1942, he struck again, this time in Nebraska. The Morrison family was his target: a husband, a wife, and their 2 small children. Their remains were discovered in their farmhouse kitchen, each one brutally executed. The crime scene was a waking nightmare. Bird had used an axe with chilling exactness, dispatching each victim one by one before ransacking the house. But what puzzled authorities was what he left behind. He hadn't taken anything of real value, just some food, a few stray dollars. It wasn't about theft. It never had been. For Jake Bird, the motivation was the act itself, the dominance, the silence, the finality of the kill. That same pattern stretched out for years. He left behind corpses in Colorado, in New Mexico, then again in Oregon. Each murder bore the same hallmarks: savage axe wounds, corpses laid out with a strange orderliness, and minimal theft. The lack of connection between law enforcement agencies in different states meant that each crime was treated in isolation, with no forensic technology or national database to tie them together. No one suspected that the same man was perfecting his craft across state lines for over a decade. Bird's luck hand, freedom, finally ran out in 1947. The city was Tacoma, Washington. He had broken into the home of Bertha Clude and her teenage daughter, Beverly. His plan was familiar: enter quietly, murder swiftly, vanish without a trace. But this time, something went wrong. Beverly didn't go quietly. She fought back, screaming and thrashing with such intensity that she caught the attention of nearby neighbors, though Bird ultimately killed both women. The commotion was enough to bring the police. It was the first and only time in his career that he was seen fleeing the scene. Police officers quickly caught up to him just a few blocks away. He was still carrying the bloodied axe when they apprehended him. To their surprise, Bird didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost calm, as though the chase had finally brought him peace. He offered no fight, no excuses, just eerie acceptance. During interrogation, Jake Bird began to talk. But what spilled from his mouth was not remorse or a search for redemption. He recounted slayings that had never been solved. He described houses, victims, weapon placement details that had never been made public. His memory was razor sharp, and his demeanor chillingly serene. He claimed responsibility for 44 murders, though detectives suspected the actual number was even higher. In Kansas, he said, he had eliminated a family of 5, including 3 children under the age of 10. In Texas, he broke into the home of an elderly couple, murdered them, and then stayed in their house for 3 full days, eating their food, sleeping in their bed, while their decomposing bodies lay just a few feet away. He told the stories like one might recount a vacation or a string of jobs held over the years. It wasn't guilt he was after, it was acknowledgement. What made Bird's confessions so unsettling wasn't only the scale, but the lack of emotion behind them. He didn't hide behind childhood trauma. He didn't plead insanity. He didn't offer any justification. He said plainly that he killed because it gave him a sense of power, because he liked it. That was all. His trial became a national event. A drifter who had eluded law enforcement for 2 decades, leaving a trail of mutilated families in his wake, had finally been brought to justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not only for the Tacoma murders, but for a growing number of cases being linked to him by circumstantial and testimonial proof. But Jake Bird wasn't finished yet. As the courtroom buzzed with anticipation of his sentencing, he did something that would forever etch his name into American folklore. Pointing at the judge, the prosecutor, and several courtroom officials, Bird uttered a chilling proclamation in a low, almost whispering voice. "I am putting the Jake Bird hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished." At first, no one took it seriously. It sounded like the melodramatic threat of a man who had lost control. But then something strange began to happen. Within a year, 6 individuals whom Bird had cursed were dead. The presiding judge died of a heart attack. The prosecutor perished in a car accident. A court reporter suffered a fatal stroke. A police officer involved with the investigation died in his sleep. One by one, those connected to the trial began dying under strange, often sudden, circumstances. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence, but the timing, the specificity made it difficult to ignore. Even hardened detectives began to whisper about the Jake Bird hex, whether real or imagined. The curse added a new layer of terror to an already horrifying legacy. Jake Bird was executed by hanging on July 15th, 1949. But the sense of dread he cast didn't die with him. In the years that followed, more mysterious deaths were reported among those who had dealt with his case. His name became legend in the Pacific Northwest, a shadow that hung over courtrooms and precincts. A warning, perhaps, that some evils don't end with the swing of a noose. But beyond the curse, beyond the courtroom theatrics, the most terrifying aspect of Jake Bird's story remains his invisibility. For nearly 2 decades, he drifted through towns, farmsteads, and train yards. He smiled at strangers. He offered to do chores. He asked for work, fixed fences, chopped wood. He was the polite traveler, the helpful man who asked for water and offered labor in return. But when night fell, he became something else, something entirely devoid of humanity. Bird's case exposed a terrifying flaw in the American justice system of the early 20th century. Without centralized databases, without interstate communication, there was no way to track a killer who moved constantly. Bird exploited this weakness masterfully. He could murder in Missouri, hop a freight train, and be in Idaho by morning. Every town thought their tragedy was an isolated event. No one realized a storm was passing through. Even today, criminal profilers and historians study Bird's trajectory. They comb through decades-old case files, hoping to find links, patterns, and locations that might account for more of his victims. Some experts believe Bird was responsible for over 60 murders, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Others believe the true number could be higher still, hidden beneath poorly documented deaths or unsolved disappearances from towns that no longer exist. Jake Bird died with those secrets. He never showed remorse, never asked for forgiveness, never gave the closure that grieving families longed for. His legacy, isn't just the staggering number of lives he took, but the fact that he could have lived among us undetected for so long. And now we turn to another name, a man whose crimes go beyond brutality into something far more sinister. If Walter Ellis was the quiet neighbor and Jake Bird the invisible drifter, then Clifford Olson was the deal-maker of death. A man who turned the murder of children into a grotesque financial transaction. He didn't just prey on the innocent. He sold their gravesites back to the very families who mourned them. But to understand how Clifford Olson became one of the most hated figures in Canadian history, we must go back to the summer of 1981, a time when the province of British Columbia was gripped by a series of child disappearances that would shake the nation to its core. The terrifying truth about Clifford Robert Olson was not only in the brutality of his crimes, but in the chilling precision with which he operated and the sheer audacity that ultimately brought him to justice. His arrest wasn't the result of forensic breakthroughs or high-tech investigative work. It was arrogance that led to his capture. By 1981, after months of terrorizing communities across British Columbia, Clifford Olson was finally arrested, not for murder, but for the attempted abduction of two young girls who had managed to escape and provide police with a detailed description of his vehicle. While in custody for the abduction attempt, authorities began to link him to a series of disappearances, but even then, they lacked the physical evidence necessary to press murder charges. That was when Olson made a move that shocked the entire country. In a move Devoid of any semblance of remorse or humanity, he proposed a transaction. He would disclose the locations of his victims' bodies in exchange for $10,000 per corpse, $10,000 for each murdered child. It was not just a proposition, it was a ransom. Law enforcement officials were horrified. The ethical and moral implications were staggering. But for the families of the missing, it was an impossible dilemma. Many had spent months in agonizing uncertainty, desperate for any news of their children. The pain of not knowing, of clinging to false hope, was consuming them. Public opinion was fiercely divided. Critics lambasted the authorities for entertaining the deal, arguing that it rewarded evil and commodified the very tragedy Olsen had orchestrated. Yet, for the grieving parents, the thought of recovering their children's remains and providing them with a proper burial was worth any price. Eventually, the deal was made. Olsen led investigators to the shallow graves of 11 children, earning $110,000 in the process. With each site he revealed, the horror deepened. Some bodies showed evidence of prolonged torture. Others had been mutilated after death. The youngest victim was just 9 years old. As he led detectives from one burial site to another, Olsen remained detached, even chatty. He joked with officers. He criticized the weather. He acted as if he were giving a casual tour rather than retracing the steps of his sadistic rampage. What emerged from his confessions was a portrait of a man utterly devoid of empathy. Olsen described his crimes in technical detail, as if listing items on a receipt. He explained how he stalked his victims, how he avoided detection, and how he improved his methods with each killing. The law enforcement officers who interviewed him, many of them seasoned veterans, reported becoming physically ill as they listened. At trial, Clifford Olsen pled guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for receiving 11 concurrent life sentences. At the time, Canadian law allowed for the possibility of parole after 25 years, even for multiple murder convictions. The sentence sparked outrage throughout the country and eventually led to reforms in Canada's legal system concerning parole eligibility for serial killers. But even behind bars, Olsen continued to manipulate and provoke. He flooded the courts with frivolous lawsuits. He wrote deranged letters to newspapers. He applied for parole hearings that he knew he would never win, all to torment the families of his victims. He boasted in interviews that he had killed far more than 11 children. He hinted at murders in other provinces and even other countries, claiming that he had targeted street kids and runaways victims whose disappearances had never been officially investigated. But he refused to give names or details unless someone paid him. Even in prison, he transformed his knowledge into a weapon. He never cooperated without compensation, using the lingering pain of unanswered questions as a form of power. What set Olsen apart from many other serial killers was the sheer scale of his sadism and his complete lack of anything resembling a conscience. Most murderers, even the most heinous, display some shred of emotional conflict. Olsen displayed nothing. He was hollow, a void, a predator who did not kill out of rage or impulse, but out of a calculated desire to dominate and annihilate. His victims were not just children, they were pieces in a game. Opportunities to inflict the maximum amount of suffering. He remained in prison for more than 30 years. Not once did he express true remorse. Not once did he acknowledge his victims as human beings. He died in 2011 at the age of 71, taking with him the secrets of other victims, other crimes, and other horrors that may never be uncovered. The case of Clifford Olsen forever changed the psyche of Canada. It shattered the illusion of safety in suburban neighborhoods. It exposed how the justice system could be exploited by someone willing to manipulate every aspect of it. It proved that some individuals are not misunderstood or mentally ill. They are malevolent, operating by codes of cruelty and domination the rest of us cannot begin to comprehend. And perhaps worst of all, Olsen showed that even in the midst of tragedy, there are those who will prey on the desperation of others, who will exploit pain for profit, and who will take a sick satisfaction in their ability to prolong the agony they have caused. Now we come to William Suff, a man whose dual identity shocked not only the city of Riverside, California, but the entire nation. By day, Suff was an unassuming civil servant working for the Riverside County Health Department. He processed documents with efficiency, kept to himself, and never made waves. To his co-workers, he was quiet and diligent. Someone you might forget the moment you left the office. But once the sun went down, William Suff transformed. He became a predator who stalked the streets of Riverside with surgical cruelty, preying on women who lived on society's ex-workers and drug-addicted, women who lacked the safety nets of traditional communities. Between 1986 and 1991, at least 13 women fell victim to his sadistic urges. Suff's crimes were not the result of sudden outbursts or impulsive decisions. They were calculated, cold, and monstrously deliberate. His victims were strangled slowly, tortured over extended periods, and their bodies mutilated in grotesque ways. Some had their breasts removed with the precision of a medical procedure. Others bore signs of cigarette burns and cuts made with razors, evidence of extended captivity and unrelenting pain. These weren't just killings. They were performances of sadism, acts of control and destruction by a man who took pleasure in suffering. What made the investigation so challenging was Suff's ability to appear completely normal. He had no criminal record that would alert investigators. He didn't arouse suspicion from neighbors. He paid his bills. He showed up to work. He was invisible. And he knew how to use that invisibility. Because he worked within the county's infrastructure, he understood how long it took for reports to be filed, how slow bureaucracies moved. He knew that women who worked the streets could go missing for days or weeks before anyone noticed. And that knowledge became a weapon. Suf didn't operate within a single comfort zone. He varied his dumping sites. He changed his victim acquisition methods. Sometimes he posed as a client. Other times he offered help. He used gloves. He cleaned his scenes meticulously. He avoided patterns, geographic, behavioral, even ritualistic ones that could help law enforcement connect the dots. But like many killers who operate without consequence for years, Suf eventually became reckless. His need for trophies grew. He started keeping photographs, clothing, jewelry, personal effects that allowed him to relive the crimes. He even started keeping these items in his own apartment, where they would later be discovered by police. The turning point came when he began inserting himself into the investigation. He lingered near crime scenes, a coup. He spoke to officers under the guise of a curious bystander. He even called in anonymous tips to the police hotline set up to find the Riverside serial killer. It was this overconfidence that eventually led to his arrest. He was pulled over for a traffic violation, and in the vehicle, police discovered evidence that tied him to one of the murders. From there, everything unraveled. A search of his apartment uncovered a treasure trove of incriminating items. The trophies, the photos, the handwritten notes. When confronted with the evidence, William Suf remained calm, even smug. He offered no confession, no apology. He simply stared as officers detailed the atrocities he had committed. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. His conviction led to a death sentence. But like Olson before him, Suf used his incarceration to manipulate the system, filing appeals, granting interviews, attempting to maintain relevance. And like Olson, he never truly confessed. He never offered closure to the families of the women he had tortured and murdered. Those women were not just names or statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters. And in many cases, their stories were never fully told, their suffering never fully known. The case of William Suf serves as a devastating reminder that evil often wears a mask of normalcy. It lives next door. It clocks in on time. It blends in so well that we fail to see it until it's too late. Suf didn't need to lurk in shadows. He hid in daylight. And that is what made him so lethal. His crimes weren't the product of madness. They were calculated acts of horror, designed and executed by a man who had learned exactly how to exploit the system designed to protect us. The story doesn't end here. There are still names left to be spoken, cases left to examine. The darkness we've uncovered is only the beginning. Jake Bird represents yet another evolution in the anatomy of predatory intelligence. He possessed a kind of instinctive awareness that went far beyond the violent impulse. He grasped a truth that most career criminals, even many serial killers, fail to understand. Geography is not just a backdrop. It's a strategic advantage. In an era long before national databases, before DNA matching and interstate task forces, Bird weaponized the very size of America against itself. He didn't simply drift between cities, he disappeared between them. State lines became his camouflage, train yards his escape route. And he knew just how long it would take for a small-town police department to connect one massacre to another before he vanished like smoke. Already stalking his next victims to counties or to states away. That's what made Jake Bird particularly terrifying. He wasn't reckless, nor was he driven by any obvious psychological unraveling. He was cold, structured, and methodical. He watched people, learned their routines, and struck when they were most exposed. His use of an axe wasn't just a throwback to a more brutal age. It was a deliberate choice. Up close, personal, loud, but not in the middle of nowhere. Rural homes, isolated, wooden doors that splinter easily. No neighbors within earshot. No one to hear a scream as it died in someone's throat. And yet, Jake Bird wasn't a phantom. He was flesh and blood. His capture in Tacoma in 1947 had proven that. The mistake that finally ended his run was an slip in planning, but an anomaly in human behavior existence. One of his intended victims, Beverly Clutt, screamed. She fought. She made noise. And Bird's carefully cultivated silence cracked under the weight of chaos. Neighbors heard. Police were called. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Bird found himself not leaving a house full of corpses, but running from one. Even in custody, Bird remained composed. The axe he'd used was still slick with blood when police apprehended him a few blocks away. He didn't run. He didn't beg. In fact, many said he looked relieved. During interrogation, he opened up, not with guilt or remorse, but with a clinical detachment that stunned detectives. He began listing names, locations, dates. He didn't try to deny what he'd done. On the contrary, he wanted them to know. He cataloged his killings with the precision of an archivist, often recalling details the authorities had kept from the press. From the bloodied farmhouse in Kansas to the elderly couple in Texas, he had slaughtered and then slept beside for 3 days. Jake Bird had remembered it all. But Bird's crimes weren't confined to death. In many ways, the horror he sowed extended long after the bodies were buried. His so-called Jake Bird hex, a curse he claimed to cast on the judge, prosecutors, and court officials, became a legend in its own right. Within a year of his sentencing, 6 of the people present at his trial had died. Heart attacks, strokes, car accidents, sudden deaths that seem statistically improbable even in isolation. Put together, they formed a pattern too eerie for many to ignore. Rational minds scoffed, but behind closed doors, even hardened officers admitted a chill had settled into their bones. Jake Bird was hanged in 1949, his final moments eerily composed. If he feared death, he didn't show it. He had spent most of his life moving toward this conclusion. A solitary figure who slipped between the cracks of modern civilization, leaving only blood and silence behind him. But even as his body dropped, the mystery surrounding the true extent of his crimes remained unresolved. Nutters of unsolved murders across Middle America were re-examined in the years following his death. Some matched his pattern, others bore chilling similarities. But with no confession and no witnesses, many were quietly filed away, again cold cases tied together only by possibility. Then there was Clifford Olson, someone who, in contrast to Bird's nomadic detachment, inserted himself into every element of his crimes. Olson didn't just kill, he relished in the suffering. He fed on the chaos. He enjoyed not only the physical destruction of his victims, but the emotional devastation of the families left behind. And worse still, he found a way to turn that devastation into currency. When Olson was finally caught in 1981, it wasn't the result of tireless police work or forensic breakthroughs. It was a matter of chance and attempted abduction gone wrong. 2 young girls, quick-thinking and brave, escaped his grasp and described his car to authorities. Olson was brought in, and as investigators began to connect him to a string of missing children, the monster revealed his most grotesque move yet. He offered to lead police to the burial sites of his victims if they paid him $10,000 for each dead child. The country recoiled in horror. For the first time in Canadian legal history, prosecutors were faced with a dilemma so morally repugnant that it threatened to fracture public trust in law enforcement altogether. Pay a serial killer for information, essentially reward him for murder, or walk away, leaving grieving families with no bodies, no funerals, no answers. The decision to pay Olson ignited a firestorm of controversy. But the families begged. Closure came at a cost $110,000 in total. In return, Clifford Olson delivered 11 bodies. Each location a fresh wound. Each grave a confirmation of unspeakable torment. Victims as young as 9 years old had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty before their deaths. Olson led the police to the sites without emotion, without regret. At times, he even joked. He referred to the process as cleanup, a business transaction, death as a ledger. In prison, he remained just as vile. He filed lawsuits, demanded attention, taunted the public and families of the dead. He hinted at more victims, runaways, street kids, transient children whose disappearances were never logged, never investigated. He would reveal more, he said, if someone paid. His letters to journalists and true crime authors became exercises in manipulation and control. He reveled in the power he continued to hold, even from behind bars. And then there was William Suff. While Clifford Olson weaponized suffering and Jake Bird exploited movement, Suff used invisibility. A bureaucrat by day and a predator by night, Suff existed on both sides of the system. He worked for the Riverside County Health Department, filing reports and processing paperwork that often crossed the desks of law enforcement officers, investigating his own crimes. His job gave him both access and insight to things serial killers rarely possess simultaneously. Between 1986 and 1991, Suff prowled the streets of Riverside, California, claiming at least 13 lives, mostly women who had turned to sex work to survive. These weren't impulsive attacks. Suff stalked his victims, selected them with purpose, and executed his murders with chilling precision. He didn't just kill, he tortured. Cigarette burns, ligature marks, post-mortem mutilation, the removal of breasts, the arrangement of bodies. All were signs not of rage, but ritual. A ritual that spanned 5 years before authorities even considered the possibility that a serial killer might be at work. The key to Suff's prolonged freedom was his ability to look normal. He rented a modest apartment, drove an unremarkable car, made friendly small talk with coworkers, even when his name surfaced early in the investigation. Due to a previous murder conviction, the beating death of his own infant daughter, he was dismissed. Too professional, they said. Too polite. Too neat. It was a single detective, Kristen Keir, finally pushed back against that narrative. She found Suff's demeanor unsettling. Too calm, too informative, too rehearsed. Her instincts triggered surveillance, and soon the image of a harmless civil servant began to unravel. Suff wasn't just a murderer. He was an archivist of his own brutality. Inside his home, detectives found trophies, journals, and photographs that mapped out his crimes in stomach-turning detail. He had documented everything down to the type of rope, the location of each wound, the timing between torture and death. At trial, Suff treated the proceedings like a performance. He represented himself for portions of it, cross-examined witnesses, argued procedural points, even corrected the prosecution when they misquoted details from his own journals. It wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. Every minute spent discussing procedure was another minute spent avoiding the raw reality of what he had done. He was convicted of 12 murders and sentenced to death. He remains on death row to this day, continuing to file appeals and deny his guilt despite a mountain of evidence. When we step back and look at these cases, Suff, Olson, Bird, Ellis, the Oakland County child killer, we begin to see the pattern more clearly. These men didn't just kill, they learned, they evolved. They used society's blind spots, its underestimation of women, of sex workers, of children, of minorities as camouflage. They exploited the limits of jurisdictional cooperation, the weaknesses in communication, and the assumptions we make about who is dangerous and who is not. And now, we must ask a final question. If they could do all this, kill dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people while hiding in plain sight, what are we missing right now? Who's out there, smiling politely in a grocery store aisle, nodding to their neighbor, opening the door for an elderly stranger while planning their next victim's final moments? The most dangerous killer is not the one who looks like a monster. It's the one who knows how to blend in. Victims, he didn't act in fits of rage or from moments of instability. He functioned with cold calculation, mapping out his movements, refining his strategy, and executing his crimes with the attention of someone fulfilling a professional obligation. What makes William Suff particularly haunting is that he didn't just act out of compulsion. He hunted with patience and studied intention. His process wasn't reckless, was engineered. Each target was chosen carefully. Each method was refined through iteration. And each detail, from the binding techniques to the disposal sites, revealed a mind that approached murder as a discipline. Suff's background in administrative work at the county health department became a disturbing asset in his evolution as a serial killer. While reviewing public records and internal memos, he gained indirect access to updates on law enforcement activity, crime patterns, and even potential investigations. His role gave him insights others lacked, and he turned that knowledge into armor. He was always one step ahead, not because he was lucky, but because he studied the very system designed to catch him. He watched the changing landscape of police investigations. He adapted to shifts in investigative priorities. As media coverage of serial killings intensified, and law enforcement began applying psychological profiling techniques more aggressively, Suff countered by modifying his victim selection and diversifying his dump sites. He understood that the less predictable he became, the longer he would go unnoticed. The gruesome truth was that William Suff, the man pushing paper by day, had transformed himself into one of the most elusive and efficient serial killers in modern American history. When the task force began piecing the case together in 1991, it wasn't because Suff made an overt mistake, it was because the accumulation of data, the consistency in methods, and the geography of the murders finally drew enough attention to force law enforcement to consider the unthinkable. These murders weren't isolated. They were the work of a singular entity. As law enforcement compiled timelines, mapped victim locations, and analyzed forensic data, one name began surfacing more than once. William Suff. Though he had been dismissed early due to his quiet, law-abiding public persona, Det. SGT, Kristen Kurz refused to let her intuition go ignored. She observed him. She followed his roots. She chronicled how his workday ended with long, unexplained drives into the very neighborhoods where bodies had turned up. It wasn't just proximity that made him suspicious, was the eerie calm he exhibited during questioning. The casual way he mirrored concern, the performative empathy he wore like a mask. When the warrant was executed on Suff's residence, what investigators discovered stripped away the illusion entirely. Trophies, journals, photographs, each item, a grotesque monument to suffering and domination. The walls of his private world were adorned with tokens from the lives he extinguished, catalogued not for memory, but for relishing control. He had preserved more than evidence. He had constructed an archive of torment. The discovery shattered any lingering doubts. The journals alone were damning, written with a precision and clarity that revealed not just the facts of the murders, but the mind of a man who saw his crimes as craft. In chilling prose, he recounted how he lured victims, how he subdued them, and how he extended their pain not out of rage, but from a perverse desire to assert total dominance. In court, Suff displayed a different kind of performance. He donned the role of legal scholar, representing himself in segments of the trial, questioning witnesses and challenging evidence, not with emotion, but with technical logic. It was a theater of arrogant objection, each point of contention another demonstration of his self-perceived superiority over the system. He wasn't fighting to prove his innocence. He was reveling in the spotlight, soaking in the attention that his crimes had finally commanded. As images of his victims flashed across the courtroom and families gave voice to their grief, Suff remained expressionless. The pain meant nothing to him. The emotional collapse of families, the gasps from jurors, the raw anger of prosecutors, none of it penetrated his carefully constructed facade. His crimes weren't merely about killing, they were about control, manipulation, and demonstrating that he, not the system, dictated the terms. He was found guilty of 12 counts of murder, though many believe the true number is significantly higher. the sentence, death. But in his final moments in court, Suf smiled. It was not the smile of a man resigned to his fate, but the grin of someone who believed he had played the game on his own terms. Now, incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, Suf continues to file appeals, each a mechanism to re-enter the discourse, to keep himself in the minds of the public and the judiciary. He has never confessed to any murder he was not forced to acknowledge. He continues to deny guilt even as the weight of evidence buries any pretense of innocence. What Suf's case revealed was not just the horrifying capacity for cruelty in one man, exposed systemic flaws in how law enforcement historically approached crimes against marginalized individuals. It raised the question, if William Suf could kill so many for so long without notice, who else might be doing the same? This question hangs heavy as we revisit the collective horror these killers represent. From the shadowy operations of the Oakland County child killer to the itinerant slaughter of Jake Bird, the psychological warfare of Clifford Olson, and the decades-long deception of Walter Ellis, what connects all these men isn't just violence. It's their ability to co-opt the normal and weaponize it. They weren't monsters in basements or woods. They were men you passed on the street. Men who understood how to manipulate expectations. Men who didn't just slip through the cracks in our systems, they danced across them. Walter Ellis, for instance, didn't merely avoid suspicion, he integrated. He existed within the same neighborhoods he hunted. He wasn't lurking at the periphery. He was part of the scenery. He nodded to neighbors, helped with yard work, gave the impression of being steady and safe, all while murdering women who would not be missed quickly enough to trigger alarms. He knew where the weak points were, both in the physical landscape and in the psychological landscape of a community's trust. Jake Bird took this strategy mobile. In a time before centralized databases and insurgency collaboration, he used America's vast geography as his camouflage. The railroad lines were his arteries. He traversed states with ease, knowing that a murder in Texas would not be connected to one in Nebraska or Oregon or Colorado. He killed with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the act endlessly, and when caught, what he offered was not guilt, but information. His confessions were less about redemption and more about cataloging achievements. His genius, if it can be called, that was in recognizing the value of information. He turned grief into leverage. He understood that the one thing more painful than a child's death was the absence of certainty. He exploited that emotional desperation to turn his own evil into profit. Each body he revealed wasn't an act of contrition, it was a transaction. And in those transactions, he stripped families not only of children, but of dignity. He showed that even after capture, a killer could still dominate his victims' families through manipulation and extortion. And then there's the Oakland County child killer, still unknown, still faceless. Perhaps the most chilling example of all, because this predator displayed a level of planning, a degree of calm, and a sense of purpose that suggests a killer not driven by compulsion, but by philosophy. Each child was abducted, held, groomed, fed, and then murdered. It was a process, one that mimicked care, one that subverted parental instinct and community logic. That killer anticipated every investigative step, every public appeal, every police move, and then, like smoke, disappeared. The case remains one of the most haunting, unresolved chapters in American criminal history, not because we lack suspects, but because the killer never stood out. These killers didn't just take lives, they took safety. They made entire cities question their ability to protect children, women, families. They forced law enforcement to look inward and admit the limits of their tools, their procedures, their assumptions. They remind us, in the most brutal terms, that evil is not always loud. It's not always chaotic or frenzied or obvious. Sometimes evil is calculated, polite, smiling, wearing a badge, holding a clipboard, bringing flowers to a neighbor. What's left behind in the wake of such evil is not just sorrow, but doubt. Doubt in systems, doubt in neighbors, doubt in the very rules of engagement that govern human decency. And in that doubt, in that quiet unraveling of trust, the legacy of these killers lingers. Because if William Suff could work in a government building while killing women at night, if Clifford Olson could turn child murder into a profit scheme, if Jake Bird could move between towns, kill families, and vanish, if Walter Ellis could mow his lawn in the morning and strangle a woman at night, if the Oakland County child killer could play caregiver before ending lives, then who is the man down the street, really? Who is the woman in the next apartment? Who are we letting into our lives, our homes, our communities? These are not just crimes, they are fractures in our collective psyche. And those fractures haven't healed. Jake Bird operated on a plane that was chilling in its psychological complexity. His crimes weren't just about violence. They were about control of his victims, control of the narrative, and perhaps most disturbingly, control of fear itself. His reputation as the so-called hexing killer was in merely a product of folklore. It was a calculated strategy, a weapon he used to manipulate the minds of those investigating him. Bird's use of psychological terror became a kind of theater, and the stage he chose was vast. Small towns, large cities, and everything in between. He understood the geography of fear better than most. While other killers were bound to familiar surroundings, Bird weaponized transience. He roamed from state to state, using the expansive American landscape not just as a hiding place, but as a means to obliterate patterns. In the pre-digital age, when information sharing between jurisdictions was sluggish or non-existent, Bird recognized that mobility was as valuable as anonymity. He deliberately avoided creating geographical footprints. His crimes appeared isolated, random, and disconnected, not because they were, but because Bird made them look that way. In every town he passed through, Bird wore a different mask. He wasn't just blending in, he was adapting, studying the local norms, identifying the gaps in law enforcement coverage, and selecting victims who were the least likely to be missed. He could be the helpful stranger one moment and a vanishing shadow the next. His ability to disappear without leaving a trace gave him the illusion of supernatural powers. It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate among investigators and prison guards alike. Jake Bird had cursed those who crossed him. When several people involved in his prosecution died under strange or untimely circumstances, the myth took root. Bird cultivated it. He leaned into the fear, smiled at the stories, and claimed credit when people perished. Whether he believed in the power of the curse or not was irrelevant. He knew others did. And that belief gave him power long after his arrest. But even within the prison system, Bird remained an anomaly. He confessed to over 40 murders, naming towns and describing details with such disturbing accuracy that authorities were forced to reopen cold cases that had long since faded from memory. The scale of his violence, combined with the seeming randomness of his targets, created a logistical nightmare for investigators. He was the perfect storm. Intelligent, mobile, untraceable. The question that haunted detectives wasn't just how many he had killed, but how many would never be known. Clifford Olson operated differently, yet no less horrifically. Where Bird relied on movement and myth, Olson thrived on manipulation and sadistic control. His crimes weren't hidden, they were paraded. While most killers are compelled to conceal their work, Olson wanted recognition. He wanted control of the narrative, and he achieved it by transforming his killings into a kind of macabre transaction, offering information in exchange for money. $10,000 per body. That was his price. His victims' children, most of them, were reduced to bargaining chips, to inventory in his twisted enterprise. What made Olson particularly repugnant wasn't just his crimes, but the glee with which he treated the suffering of others. He understood that grief creates desperation, and he weaponized that desperation against the very families he had already destroyed. His victims' parents, crushed under the weight of uncertainty, were forced to consider the unthinkable, paying their child's killer for information about where their child had been discarded. For some, The need for closure outweighed the moral revulsion. They paid. Olson was rewarded. The controversy sparked nationwide outrage, but Olson didn't care. He had achieved what he wanted: control, power, and the spotlight. In many ways, Olson was the embodiment of performative evil. He treated every interrogation, every press appearance, every negotiation like a stage play. The investigators weren't just trying to solve crimes. They were forced to engage with a man who seemed to derive joy from their discomfort. His interviews were chilling, not just for what he revealed, but for how casually he revealed it. He would recount the abduction, torture, and murder of a child with the same tone someone might use to describe a routine drive to the grocery store. Like Suff, Olson kept trophies. Like Ellis, he blended into his surroundings. Like Bird, he created mythology around his name. But he went one step further. He demanded to be paid for it. In doing so, he exposed the most vulnerable parts of the justice system: how far people will go, and what they will sacrifice in pursuit of truth. Olson made society pay twice. Once with its children, then again with its conscience. Walter Ellis, in contrast, made no demands. He didn't negotiate. He didn't confess. He didn't leave notes, clues, or coded language. He simply disappeared into the framework of everyday life, returning only when he chose to strike again. He was the specter of Milwaukee streets, the shadow in the alley that no one noticed until it was too late. For over 20 years, Ellis operated in silence, not because he feared being caught, but because silence suited him. It protected his illusion. He was the neighbor, the helper, the man next door. Ellis's victims were marginalized women's sex workers, addicts, individuals whose lives were already pushed to the periphery. He chose his targets carefully, knowing their disappearances would rarely make headlines. He varied his methods just enough to avoid establishing a clear pattern. He left just enough distance between his crimes to prevent investigative momentum. And he lived among the very people he victimized, attending block parties, fixing neighbors' plumbing, helping carry groceries. For the community, he was forgettable. For his victims, he was death personified. The story of Walter Ellis shattered any remaining illusion that serial killers must stand out, that they must be socially awkward or visibly disturbed. Ellis was the antithesis of the Hollywood psychopath. He was ordinary to the point of invisibility. And that's what made him so terrifying. And then there's William Suff, the bureaucratic predator. His evil wasn't cloaked in mystery or myth. It was precise, practiced, and horrifyingly efficient. Suff hunted with the foresight of a tactician. He didn't stumble upon victims. He selected them, stalked them, and struck only when conditions were perfect. His delivery van became a mobile trap, his schedule a camouflage, and his job in public service a shield. What made Suf's crimes particularly chilling was the way he repurposed the tools of normalcy for deviance. His uniform became a disguise. His daily routes doubled as reconnaissance. He studied the lives of his victims before ending them. He exploited their need, their trust, their isolation. In doing so, he created a world where safety itself became a deception. The evidence found in his home photographs, journals, personal belongings of the dead wasn't just shocking. It was a catalogue of suffering, a testament to the deliberate nature of his acts. Suf wasn't acting on impulse. He was building a legacy, one murder at a time. His detailed records revealed not just what he did, but how much he enjoyed doing it. He ranked victims by the pain they endured, recorded their final words, critiqued his own methods. To him, it was craftsmanship. To society, it was horror beyond comprehension. And yet, the most haunting part of Suf's story, the crimes themselves, how long it took for anyone to notice. Despite a prior conviction for the murder of his own infant daughter, Suf was released, hired by the government, and allowed to rebuild a life that would serve as the perfect cover for his second spree. The very systems designed to monitor and contain violent offenders had failed completely, and that failure cost more than a dozen lives. Each of these killers represents a different face of evil. The drifting terror of Jake Bird, the manipulative cruelty of Clifford Olson, the invisible menace of Walter Ellis, the institutional camouflage of William Suf, and the calculating ghost of the Oakland County child killer. But together, they tell a single story: that evil is not always loud, not always messy, and not always obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, ordinary, and that is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all. These cases forced a reckoning, not just within law enforcement, but within society itself. They exposed the limitations of our assumptions, that killers must be outsiders, that danger announces itself, that the systems we build are infallible. But the truth, as these men proved, is much darker. Danger can smile. It can wear a uniform. It can wave from across the street. And it can walk among us for years, unseen and undetected, until it decides it's time to strike again. Each time we revisit these stories, we are reminded that true horror does not always come with music or masks. Sometimes it comes with structure, with a clipboard and a delivery van, with a man who never raises his voice, with a neighbor who helps shovel snow, with a guy who shows up for work every day, smiles at his coworkers, and then drives into the night looking for his next victim. And as long as such people exist, as long as evil can adapt, learn, and hide behind the very systems we trust, we must remain vigilant. Because the greatest weapon these killers ever used wasn't tea, a knife, or a pair of gloves. It was our willingness to believe they didn't exist. Jake Bird understood with chilling clarity that fear was a Tula psychological weapon as potent as any blade he ever wielded. His reputation for invoking a so-called hex on those who prosecuted him was indeed mere folklore. It was a calculated part of his strategy. Whether this legend emerged organically from coincidence or was something Bert encouraged through cryptic remarks, the result was the same. It instilled unease. Witnesses hesitated. Officers second-guessed their conclusions. Prosecutors wondered whether they were contending with something beyond human malevolence. In truth, there was no magic behind his dark predictions. Most likely, Bird used connections within the prison system to orchestrate acts of revenge, or simply banked on the inevitability of death among aging men in law enforcement. But the illusion worked. Bird successfully elevated himself from mere murderer to myth, blurring the boundaries between folklore and forensic evidence. And in doing so, he gained a psychological edge that even the most brutal criminals rarely achieve. He wasn't just feared, he was revered, as if something more than human lurked behind his eyes. Clifford Olson, by contrast, had no need for supernatural legends. His evil was not cloaked in myth, it was presented plainly in stark, cold rationality. Olson didn't just kill children. He commodified their suffering. He monetized grief. He turned horror into a business plan. During his incarceration, Olson entered into negotiations with authorities that horrified even the most seasoned investigators. For every new location of a buried child's body, he demanded compensation, thousands of dollars for each revelation. In his twisted logic, he wasn't selling secrets. He was simply assigning a monetary value to human closure. This was not desperation. It was strategy. Olson understood how desperation warped judgment, how grief dismantled resolve. The families of his victims were not just mourning. They were suspended in a purgatory of not knowing. And he recognized that this uncertainty, this liminal state, had market value. He parceled out information in increments, maintaining control while maximizing his gain. Manipulating both law enforcement and the shattered families who longed for even a sliver of resolution. His demeanor was cooperative, even courteous. To the untrained eye, he may have appeared as a man trying to right his wrongs, but it was a performance, a game, one where every move was calculated, every revelation transactional. In press conferences, he appeared as a man offering help, speaking softly and confidently, as if he were the grieving party. It was this manipulation, this ability to mask his sadism with the illusion of redemption that made him among the most psychologically dangerous predators ever studied. Then there was William Suff, who presented perhaps the most terrifying evolution of this pattern. The predator who weaponized the very institutions meant to protect society. Suff didn't just exist within the system, he thrived in it. His job as a county government employee gave him cover, mobility, and credibility. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in the very places people are taught to feel safe. He knew the logistics of county schedules, the locations of vulnerable populations, and how to exploit the blind spots in bureaucratic oversight. Suff had access to public records. He could map out areas where women were least likely to be missed and plan his movements accordingly. His day job, delivering supplies and furniture, gave him a plausible reason to be anywhere at any time. When questioned, he had airtight alibis. He wasn't a drifter or an outcast. He was a functioning part of the very machine tasked with protecting citizens from monsters like him. His apartment, when finally searched, revealed a chilling duality. Photographs of his victims posed grotesquely, some while alive, and others after death were meticulously catalogued. There were jars containing body parts, trophies, articles of clothing, pieces of jewelry, strands of hair. It was systematic, methodical. Suff had created a museum of suffering in his private space, arranged with the kind of precision found in scientific labs or archival vaults. Even his record-keeping was clinical. He maintained journals, not only describing each murder in vivid detail, but analyzing them, ranking them, comparing methods of restraint, types of wounds, the duration of victim survival. These weren't the ravings of a madman. They were the notes of a man studying his work, refining his technique, improving his level of introspection was grotesque. He was aware of the horror he inflicted, and he relished it. What unites all these cases is not merely the brutality of the acts committed, but the clarity with which the killers understood the systems around them, social, legal, and psychological. They succeeded not because those systems failed, but because they learned how to manipulate them with chilling precision. They understood how communities function, how assumptions are made, how trust is built, how law enforcement allocates resources. They didn't operate in shadows or forests or sewers like cinematic villains. They operated in daylight through neighborhoods, in jobs, churches, and schools. They wore clean clothes. They paid taxes. They learned people's names. They made themselves invisible by becoming normal. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their eventual capture is how arbitrary it was. None of these predators were apprehended through extraordinary detective work or cutting-edge forensics alone. Walter Ellis was finally linked to his crimes not by a brilliant deduction, but by DNA evidence gathered decades after many of his murders, technology that simply hadn't existed while he was active. Jake Bird was caught only because he was sloppy in one of his later murders and then boasted about his hex under interrogation. Clifford Olson was already in custody for unrelated crimes when authorities began to realize the full scope of his atrocities. William Suff was finally identified due to circumstantial forensic evidence. Few tire tracks, some fibers, a blood trace in a van. And then there's the Oakland County child killer never caught. Despite one of the most exhaustive investigations in Michigan history, involving dozens of jurisdictions and decades of effort, the case remains unsolved. The killer vanished, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and fear. Here, they might have walked among the very search parties, scouring woods and parking lots, may have comforted crying parents, may have helped tape missing child posters to windows. And if they're still alive, they could be someone's neighbor today. These cases make one truth inescapable. For every killer we catch, there may be others just as calculated, just as hidden, just as patient, still perfecting their methods. They're not creatures of the night with disfigured faces and ominous stares. They're people who wave hello, who bring in the trash bins, who smile in passing, who seem, in every outward way, entirely ordinary. Evil, as revealed in these cases, is not always loud. It does not always scream or wear a mask. Often, it whispers, it waits, it conforms. And then, when the moment is right, it strikes without fanfare, and often without consequence. The systems we trust, our laws, our communities, our instincts are only as effective as our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. That someone can be both respected and evil. That the most vulnerable among us are often the least protected. That we still underestimate the capability of those who seem the least threatening. These 5 killers, Suff, Ellis, Bird, Olson, and the Oakland County Predator, reveal a different facet of this terror. One operated under the guise of public service. Another behind the dull anonymity of a janitor's uniform. A third cloaked himself in regional superstition. A fourth used charm and businesslike cruelty to exploit grief. The last disappeared into thin suburban air, leaving only questions in his wake. They were not caught because society was prepared for them. They were caught because they made a mistake. That's the most haunting lesson of all. Not that they were monsters, but that they were so nearly perfect at pretending not to be. And perhaps, somewhere, others are learning from their successes, studying the gaps, memorizing the rhythms, waiting. This story, like the investigations it chronicles, remains open not because there is more to tell, but because there always is.